Welcome everyone. I am Lady Safiya bint al-Shahid and I hail from the peaceful and mercantile barony of St Florian de la Riviere, which is in the Kingdom of Lochac, so mundanely Brisbane, Australia. I'd like to begin by first acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. So, welcome to Apples of Love, where we'll be taking a brief exploration into the history of aubergines in Iberia. So some quick disclaimers before we begin. I've tried to use the word aubergine for most of this class because I'm told that's what most of the rest of the world uses. Here in Australia, we actually use the word eggplant because when British colonists in Southeast Asia discovered the plant, they thought, gee, that plant looks like it's growing eggs. So if I am switching between the two, I promise I'm still talking about the exact same vegetable. Don't panic. Also, disclaimer number 2, culturally, Australians have a slightly higher threshold for casual profanity than many other places. So apologies in advance if something does slip out. I'll try and be on my best behaviour. So without further ado, let's get started. So aubergines, or eggplants, so the species name is Solanum melongena, were first domesticated in Southeast Asia at least as early as 300 BCE, but it's likely that their wild progenitors were harvested long before that. Several early Sanskrit texts describe them as excellent vegetable, the royal melon, and the blue fruit. And even this early in history, they're popular as both a food and a medicine. Their exact timeline for the migration westward is unclear, but over the next few centuries, aubergines gradually spread through Asia and the Middle East. Eventually, they were introduced to the Iberian Peninsula, and this came through the Muslim expansion and the conquest of Al-Andalus in the 7th and 8th centuries CE. They then enjoy many, many centuries as a popular vegetable, and historian Gil Marx attributes the later popularity of eggplant dishes in the broader Mediterranean to the Sephardic diaspora following the Christian Reconquista. We'll touch a little bit more on the cultural importance of eggplants in Sephardic culture later, but yes, that's the general gist. And evidently they remain popular enough as a food source in Iberia to be among the first plants brought from Spain to the Americas during colonial expansion. So Jose de Acosta, a Jesuit missionary and scholar, lists apples of love, aubergines, as among the first plants in his book, The Natural and Moral History of the Indies. Moving on to the actual varieties of eggplants that we see in Iberia. So in the 12th century text, Kitab al-Falaha, Andalusian agriculturist Ibn al-Awam describes 4 varieties of eggplant by the colour of the fruit and the colour of the flowers. Unfortunately, though, he doesn't really describe the shape of the fruit, which is what we'd more consider to be a distinguishing feature of varieties nowadays. So the 4 varieties he describes are the Egyptian, white fruit and violet flowers, Syrian, violet fruit and light blue flowers, local, which are dark purple with purple flowers, and the Cordoban, which is the black fruit and purple flowers. So those are the 4 varieties that are actually described in period, and by the 19th century, contemporary authors suggest that there are more than 30 varieties of eggplant grown in Spain. But it's a little bit unclear if we'd actually consider these to be separate varieties with our modern understanding of the term. And that brings us to issues with interpreting and extrapolating historical evidence. What are the modern equivalents and how do we identify what is comparable to a historical version? So selective breeding as an active and conscious practice is a relatively modern concept. Remember that it wasn't until 250 years post-period that Gregor Mendel, who we now consider to be the father of genetic science, ran his famous experiment with pea plants. Prior to this, farmers had a very basic understanding of the premise of crossbreeding and that it often produced better plants. But of course, they had no reliable way of breeding for specific outcomes because they didn't understand the genetics behind it. So with that in mind, and with the understanding that eggplants are self-pollinating plants, meaning that they don't really need any external help, although bees, of course, would increase yield, We can conclude with relative certainty that some modern varieties of eggplants are fairly similar to those grown pre-1600s. A lot of the later mutations that we see in terms of what we select for now, like colour, texture, that sort of stuff.
Size, they want really big eggplants.
Yes, so size is a little bit more related to predictable genetics and heritable genetics, whereas stuff like colour, especially the striping that you see on some modern varieties of eggplants, you can't actually inherit that. That's got to be a grafted thing or a, what's the word for it? Like a genetic clone, effectively. So that's the striped variety is probably less likely to be seen in Iberia during our period. But I mean, there's no reason that you couldn't use them in a modern recipe or in a modern version of a historical recipe if that's what you have available. So with that in mind, our ability to identify historical taxes is still somewhat limited. So selective breeding in recent centuries, of course, linking back to that striping and the sort of the fancy colours and the exotic eggplants, especially with the commercialisation and globalisation of agriculture. And it changes the available genomic material that we have today. Obviously, now that we've got the wider contact and the ability to transport plant material across continents within, 24 hours, we can bring in genetics from East Asian cultivars and breed them in with Iberian eggplants. All that sort of stuff does make it difficult to determine exactly what kind of varieties would have been used historically. And there's also the changes in language over time. So obviously language is fluid. And of course, my presentation is based largely on what I can read, which is not a lot of Spanish. So I'm relying on translations and historical interpretations. And obviously that reflects the understanding of horticulture and plant growth and culinary and medicinal uses of the times. So there is a bit of a grey area there. So at the end of all that, how close is close enough when it comes to interpreting historical eggplant recipes? Well, in modern Spain, the distribution of aubergine varieties is largely correlated to preferred preparation methods. So in the south, where you more commonly have fried or stewed eggplants, the fruit tends to be those nice large globe eggplants. Whereas in the north, where you have stuffed eggplant being a more common dish, the fruit is generally quite long. That being said, almost any European variety of eggplant will work well in a historical Iberian dish. All eggplants are beautiful, and it's important to remember that it's not the size that matters, it's how you use it. So, eggplants as a curse or a cure. The Persian polymath Ibn Sina, who is widely considered to be the father of modern medicine, and a number of other contemporary scholars, attribute a number of ailments to the consumption of aubergine. These include, but are not limited to, pimples, ophthalmia, ulcers, impetigo, leprosy, elephantiasis, intestinal constriction and blockage, blood thickening and blackening, insomnia, epilepsy, and excess production of black bile. So the attribution of these ailments to eggplants is probably due to the presence of solanine in the fruit. Obviously, that's a feature within the whole nightshade family. Potatoes, tomatoes all have some level of solanine in them. But for context, the LD50, or the median lethal dose, which is, the amount of solanine to kill the average adult, is between 3 and 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, which effectively means that the average adult would need to eat about 40 or so raw eggplants in a single sitting to actually die from solanine poisoning. And honestly, if you're eating that many eggplants in one sitting, you probably have some other problems to worry about anyway. So the somewhat less serious alternative to the link with solanine is that these ailments are possibly linked to the high fibre content of the fruit and the occasionally flatulent consequences of eating it. The other important thing to note is that while many of these authors are describing these horrific ailments that maybe are caused by eggplants, They're also considering them to have a number of health benefits. So these are mostly related to digestive health, probably related to the fiber content again, and they rely heavily on sensible harvesting and preparation practices. So effectively, in order to actually get benefits from eggplant and to not suffer any adverse effects, you should harvest the fruit when it's ripe, salt and soak the fruit before you cook it, which you kind of should do anyway because it generally tends to take the bitterness out of the fruit, and you should cook it prior to eating. These are all pretty sensible practices. We follow these all today anyway, with the exception of several Southeast Asian cultivars where they are harvested prior to ripening. And that's generally the small ones that actually look like eggs. So now we come to the apples of love and insanity. And throughout our period, especially towards the later end in the 15th and 16th centuries, aubergines sort of gain this reputation as an aphrodisiac, and they're variously known across the continent as apples of love or mad apples. And some modern authors do describe these names as being contradictory, but it's not, I think, unreasonable to suggest that historical authors may have been of the opinion that love and madness are two sides of the same coin. As an aside, though, the species name for eggplant, melongena, actually derives from the Italian mala insana, which just means mad apple. And this reputation as an aphrodisiac is how we come to this absolutely delightful image from the Tecumenum sanitatis. This is the version that is held in a museum in Vienna. And there are two lovers who have, in the presence of all of this ripe and love-inducing fruit, are canoodling in a field of eggplants while being chastised for their impropriety by another woman. And look, to be honest, even looking through a purely modern lens at this image and this idea of eggplants as an aphrodisiac, it's not difficult to suggest that the suggestive shape of some of the aubergine varieties might lend itself to more amorous implications. Of course, you'll all be familiar with the eggplant emoji that is somewhat common on the internet these days. It's also likely that the persistence of humoral theory may have contributed to this reputation as an aphrodisiac. So the idea that spicy or bitter, as eggplant is, bitter foods were sanguine and they would inflame passions and increase hot-bloodedness. So Ibn al-Awam, the agriculturist that we mentioned earlier, suggested that aubergines were both popular and prized in Al-Andalus. This sentiment is also echoed by the 12th century poet Ibn Sara from what is now Santarém in Portugal, who described the eggplant rather romantically, I might add, as spheroid fruit, pleasing to taste, fattened by water gushing in all gardens, glossy cupped in its petiole, heart of a lamb in vulture's claws. And this is I just think it's an absolutely delightful way to describe them, especially when you consider some of the smaller varieties that are this beautiful little spheroid fruit in this bright green petiole. This idea of eggplants being a very sort of romantic and prized fruit is continued almost throughout the entire period that they exist or that they are popular in Iberia. But despite that popularity, they're still generally considered to be a Muslim or Jewish food. The idea of eggplant as a Jewish food stuck to the point of becoming an ethnic stereotype, and sometimes even to the point of insult. There are several accounts in period of authors comparing Jewish features to eggplants and stuff like that. It's not something that I think I'd like to repeat word for word, but it's definitely something to be conscious of, I think, in interpreting some of the way we use our language and the way we consider the impact of historical taxa. That being said, though, I think the most charming testament to the popularity of aubergines is the Cantiga de las Berenjenas, which is the Sephardic Song of the Eggplants, which lists 35 ways to prepare eggplant. So this is the third way that is prepared by Miss Hoya de Axote. She boiled them and cooked them after removing the stems, liberally mixing cheese and oil, and she called them by their name, almodrote dish. So as we sort of touched on earlier, there is definitely a case to be made for the enduring popularity of eggplant being related to Jewish diaspora throughout Europe. A lot of the modern Jewish populations that have ancestry in Sephardic culture in Spain and Portugal have these very similar eggplant dishes that obviously have been passed down through generations. And that in itself, I think, is almost another period of study. And I think that would be absolutely fascinating to dig into, though I've only just briefly touched on the surface of it. So today, aubergines endure as an economically important crop in Iberia. So according to the FAO, Spain is the 10th largest producer of eggplant globally, producing 245,150 tonnes of eggplants in 2019. And Spain and Portugal are both in the top 10 eggplant producing countries by yield, producing almost 65 and 45 tonnes per hectare respectively. So are there any questions?
Is there any interlinking in aubergines' reputation as an aphrodisiac with its reputation for being a food of Muslim and Jewish culture, or were those like two completely different types of things where it's like there's like, is there an aphrodisiac for the Christian majority peoples and it wasn't for Jewish or Muslim people, or was that something that pretty much everyone in Europe during our period would kind of see as an attribute of it?
It doesn't seem to be specific to a particular culture or region. Sort of across the board, even from those really early Sanskrit texts, there is this discussion of both the detriments and benefits of eating aubergines, and it seems to be pretty consistently linked to, I suppose you'd call it like inflamed passions and this idea of, again, the hot-blooded humoral theory. So no, it doesn't seem to be specific to a culture, but that being said, I wouldn't be surprised given how long how long Muslim rule lasted in Spain, if that hadn't already become an underlying concept and sort of the foundation for the later Christian understanding of the fruit. But no, that's a good question. And I think I'd probably, to give you a 100% sure answer, I'd probably have to do a bit more digging into it.
It definitely sounds logical, and thank you for answering that.
That's all right. Of course, during like through the rest of Europe, basically, you see the same sort of concepts as well. But it is worth noting that that manuscript, the Tecumenum Sanitatis, that I had the picture from, is one that has several copies from different periods and places. And so there is a bit of a grey area between, well, what is the actual cultural knowledge at the time and place that we are looking at individual manuscripts in? Or is this just that someone from one monastery has copied the pictures and the text from someone in another monastery? So there is a bit of that grey area.
Yergain actually wrote, I have a question about a specific dish. Thick eggplant from Del Nola. I test cooked it for a feast and loved the flavor, but the texture was congealed snot, as her husband calls it. How, like, have you cooked something in like the Del Nola style of a dish? And
I actually have, and that is in fact the not that specific recipe, but that video I'm about to play after this is actually a recipe from Danola. I did find a similar thing with the texture, but as you'll see in the video, I did make a couple of errors along the way, which may have contributed to that. I think also the wording and of course like the translations. So the translation that I was working from by, I've forgotten her name now, Bridget Nakiran, who I think was in the Colegio earlier. Her translation, as she states at the start of her translation, is based upon the Spanish translation of the Catalan manuscript. So it's sort of been translated twice. So obviously there's the potential for a bit of confusion and sort of a sliding of terms across those two translations that maybe we're missing a bit of information. But yes, to answer your question again, I did have a very similar sort of texture response when I tried this particular recipe. So it's not just you, it's definitely I guess you'd call it a feature, not a bug, maybe.
Dang, dang, dang. And then Magda was came up with a follow-up question to that, which is, what is your personal favorite aubergine recipe? And then Philadeus had an additional question, was, are there any other recipes that come into your presentation or ones that you're looking into doing more research on?
Yes. So I think my favorite eggplant recipe so far, and I haven't tried a huge number of them, has actually been from the opera of Bartolomeo Scappi. It's a little bit less snotty in texture, and it's got it's very similar actually to the recipe that I am about to show you in this video, but it's a little more green and fresh. It's less spiced and more herbed, which is quite nice. And with a good sort of gooey cheese, bit of mozzarella or even some Parmesan in there, I think it kind of lifts it a little bit. And that's definitely one that I am intending to make whenever we are next able to get to a camping event, because it's high protein with the cheese and it's super quick to whip up. So that is my favorite personally at the moment. I mean, this could all change as I try more recipes.
What other kind of recipes are you looking to experiment with when it comes to this particular plant?
So I'd like to go through and try all of the Danola ones. So Danola actually mentions 4 different eggplant recipes. Interestingly, they're all in the same sort of theme of casserole eggplants. I think it would be interesting to try and find some other ones in Iberia that are maybe stuffed eggplants, as is sort of more common today. I think I'd also like to try some stuff further afield. So looking at the Asian eggplant recipes and sort of working my way eastward across the globe, I think would be quite an interesting challenge, and especially to then sort of trace it back through the progression of eggplant to Iberia. I think that would be really cool. But as for recipes that are in this presentation, the couple that we've sort of touched on, and then the Danola one coming up in the video.
Fantastic. And then I see one more question in the chat from Bomina, which is, what exactly does the word almodrati mean?
That's a good question. I haven't actually found, I have to admit, I didn't look particularly deep into this one, but no one has a direct translation that I've seen. They just sort of mentioned that it is an eggplant dish. So I think I'd probably have to look that up to give you a better answer than just eggplant dish. It is commonly made, I think nowadays, with almond meal, but I'm not sure if that was the common period way of doing it. Hello everyone, today we'll be cooking moji casserole, one of the 4 eggplant dishes from the Libra del Koch by Roberto Danola. Take eggplants, neither very big nor very small, but middling, and open them in the middle and cast them to cook with your salt. And when they are well cooked, drain them with a cloth which is rough, and then chop them a great deal, and cast them in a frying pan or kettle, and cast in good oil. And take toasted bread and grate it. Cast it there within, and cast in aged grated cheese. and when it is stirred for a good while over the fire, have ground dry coriander, caraway and pepper, and cloves and a little ginger, and stir it over the fire, and cast in some eggs and stir it over the fire until it is hard, and then take a casserole and cast in a bit of oil and place it in the casserole, and beat some eggs with pepper and saffron and cloves, and some of the same toasted bread that is contained in the casserole, and some of the grated cheese, and make it thick and place it on top in the manner of a facing, and put your yolks on it and coagulate it in the oven or with a cuchadera, which is an iron pot lid with coals on top. And when it is coagulated, remove it from the fire and cast on top of it a dish of honey, which is very good, and your duke's powder. This same casserole can be made with chard or carrots. For this dish, you will need 3 large eggplants, 5 eggs, 1 cup of fresh breadcrumbs or panko, 1 cup of manchego or other hard cheese, half a teaspoon each of coriander, caraway and pepper, 1/4 teaspoon each of ginger and cloves, 1/4 cup of oil, and 3 threads of saffron. Optional extras include honey and powdered juice to serve. Begin by cutting your eggplants in half. Try and do this carefully so that you don't shake your camera. Get your Salt Bae on and generously season to remove the bitterness, and then add water and boil until the eggplants are tender. Once you've drained and chopped your eggplants, you can add them to a pot. I've done this off camera to avoid getting wet eggplant juice all over my bench top. And I've also changed my pot because the portable stove doesn't like the one that I used to start with, but I highly recommend you do this all in one pot to avoid washing up. Add your oil and stir on a medium heat. And then add 3/4 of your breadcrumbs. Or add all of them and pretend that you were meant to do that all along. Add 3/4 of your cheese and stir until the cheese just starts to soften. Stir in your spices until everything is coated, then turn off the heat. Add 3 of the eggs and stir until everything is glossy and eggy. Keep stirring because you really don't want to find chunks of scrambled eggs in there later. Carefully scoop your eggplant mix into a lightly oiled casserole dish. You want to gently smoosh the mixture towards the corners and smooth out the top so that you have a nice base for your eggy topping. Move the dish to the side and then have a think about what vessel the leftovers will fit in. I ended up going with this small terracotta dish for the aesthetic. The large casserole dish I'll be taking to a potluck dinner tonight. Crack the remaining 2 eggs into a bowl and add the saffron, pepper and cloves. Beat until just combined, then add breadcrumbs and cheese. Make sure you save a little bit of the breadcrumbs and cheese to make the top extra crispy. Gently spoon your egg mixture on top of your eggplants. Then give up and just pour it on top. Spread the egg mixture evenly and then sprinkle on the reserved breadcrumbs and cheese. Bake for 20 minutes at 180 degrees Celsius or 350 freedom units. Once your mohi casserole is out of the oven, you can garnish with honey and powder juice like Danola recommends. And there she is. The spices add a wonderful fragrance and the crust on top is delightfully cheesy. The extra breadcrumbs made this a bit more dense than expected, but still very tasty. 2 thumbs up, would recommend. Alrighty, so that's that. That is essentially the end of the class. If I do that again, my second reading of the recipe, I actually wonder if the egg is supposed to be pre-cooked into an actual layer and then placed on top almost like a pie crust. Definitely something to experiment with, but my first instinct was kind of just do it like a pasta bake and see what happens. Does anyone have any questions on the video, the presentation, just random questions about eggplants in general?
We do have a question on the video. Did you let the eggplant sit in the salt to pull out the bitterness first, or did you go straight to boiling?
So I was quite lazy and I just kind of threw the salt in the pot with the eggplant. I just kind of figured it's kind of the same thing. Yeah, like you mentioned, Aisha, it might be better to just sort of leave it leave it salted and with a weight on top to drain out some of the moisture first. I think that would probably help to negate the snotty texture issue that Ergan and I both had in our attempts to make an eggplant recipe from Danola. He sort of doesn't actually, from memory, he doesn't actually describe salting it as a separate step, but I mean, obviously, like we discussed earlier with the translation and translation of the translation, it can be a little more difficult.
Coolio. And then have you done a smoked patty recipe from, and I'm probably going to butcher this, Ibn Sayyar al-Warraq?
No, I haven't, but that sounds amazing. I will look that up.
Alrighty then. Well, I just want to say, milady, thank you so very much for teaching today. It's been fantastic, and I didn't know any of the stuff about eggplants before, so it all looks good and it all looks yummy. So thank you so very much.
Thank you. And thank you, Antonio, for your amazing help with facilitating. I really appreciate it. It's made my my first official online class very easy.